Final Fantasy XIV, one of gaming's truly miraculous success stories. What began as a famously botched attempt at a famous franchise's re-entry into the MMO space became one of the most successful and beloved games of the genre, with critically acclaimed expansions and a dedicated fanbase. Its story is one of epic destinies, complex political maneuvers, and controversial subject matter. And amidst the game's truly staggering amount of content lies a long, detailed story with a bunch of social commentary, a flexible class system that offers a huge variety of playstyles, and most importantly, the Gentlemen of Light. Hello, I'm the Game Professor, and welcome to Games is Lit 101. There are a lot of people who have wanted me to talk about Final Fantasy XIV for I don't even know how many years now, and the time has finally come. But we're not going to talk about things like the game's themes of religion, oppression, or the sins of capitalism. I mean, what do you think this is, a show about literature? No, we're talking about how this beautiful, beautiful man elevates the genre of slapstick comedy by intentionally breaking the game's animation systems. But first, some context. How does character animation work in a game like Final Fantasy XIV? The first thing to note is that while video games have made incredible strides in portraying their characters with lifelike motion capture technology, that's simply not feasible in something like Final Fantasy XIV. When you look at a game like The Last of Us Part 2, you're looking at a heavily scripted experience. Every scene is played out in great detail, with every movement captured exactly as a real body did it, and then animators use that motion data to help in creating some shockingly detailed visuals. And for a game like this, even if you're unethically exploiting your workforce to squeeze absurd hours out of them, it works, and it looks absolutely incredible. And of course, detailed character animation isn't solely the realm of photorealism either. Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart sure doesn't look realistic, but it looks believable, and every movement is so meticulously crafted, the game practically looks like an animated movie. But those games are able to do that because they're relatively focused and small. An RPG generally has a lot more content than that, and so you can't realistically put that degree of time and effort into every little visual detail. And a game like Final Fantasy XIV in particular is expansive, to say the absolute least, not only in its amount of content, but in the diversity of that content. In most games, the player character only does so many different types of things. Mario needs a lot of animations, for instance, but nearly all of them relate to jumping, running, falling, etc., because Mario is a platformer, and that's most of what happens. And there's not a whole lot going on outside of the action of the gameplay. NPCs mostly stand in one place and talk to Mario with no voice acting, so a simple gesture and mouth flapping get that job done just fine. In a game like this, the developers can focus on a relatively narrow range of animations because the game only features so many different types of action. But if Mario also had a sword, a gun, and an axe, and a spear, and a bow, and had a lot of detailed conversations with emotive, occasionally voiced NPCs, and had to show a broad range of emotions within these conversations, you see what I'm getting at. The work stacks up pretty quick. In RPGs, there tends to be a far wider range of subject matter being handled at any given time. Sure, one quest might have you punching giant ladybugs, but the next will have you talking with a friend about a shocking event, or convincing a lazy guard to get back to work. And similarly, the NPCs will need more detailed movements when you're talking to them because there are a lot of different emotions, actions, and reactions that go into a game with this much talking. Seriously, Final Fantasy XIV has so much talking. A game with this many conversations, in this many different situations, with this many different characters, requires a way for those characters to look emotive and alive without the frankly impossible task of hand animating every detail of every conversation the player might have, which is why games like this tend to have conversation systems that generate those visuals. A lot of my knowledge on this, by the way, comes from the excellent YouTube channel New Frame Plus. They talk about animation in video games specifically, and their episode about Mass Effect Andromeda and everything that might have gone wrong with that whole conversation system goes a whole lot more in depth into how this works than I'm going to in this video. So if this is an aspect of video game production that catches your eye, definitely check out that channel. Link is in the description and also right up there. Rather than uniquely animate every individual second of cutscenes, games on this scale have a system featuring a series of animations that characters can utilize in conversation. Mouths that move through a series of positions to mimic the way lips move to form the words being said, facial expressions to match the tone and mood of the conversation, body language to accentuate the character's feelings in the moment. And once you see how this works, you can recognize it in most large-scale games. These conversation systems are a very important tool for games like Final Fantasy XIV, and one that's ingrained into the minds of most RPG players at this point. We see it all the time, and recognize it almost like it's a stylistic choice. It's just how these games operate. It can result in some scenes feeling a little stiff, since characters will always stand in an idle position, perform one of these scripted movements, and then return to their idle pose, so some games put in a lot of work to make it pretty much invisible. But for the most part, even when this works really well, it's still fairly obvious, so anyone who plays a decent amount of video games is probably pretty used to seeing it. And when an entire genre sets that kind of universally recognizable expectation, a game can get a really big reaction by intentionally smashing it to smithereens. Hildibrand, the Gentleman of Light, is one of my absolute favorite things about Final Fantasy XIV. He's a terrible detective and an altogether incompetent person, but he does his best to help others whenever the opportunity presents itself, and shenanigans ensue. His quests are essentially the comedic side stories of Final Fantasy XIV, and one of their main genres of comedy is probably best described as slapstick. Now, personally, I'm not a big fan of slapstick comedy. I know, the pretentious video game themes understander isn't really big on slapstick, big surprise, right? But really, it can get a chuckle out of me sometimes, and if it's visually clever enough, it can legitimately be pretty fun, but for the most part, it just doesn't really do it for me. That said, Hildibrand is a huge, glaring exception. These quests absolutely slay me every time, and I love them so much. And lest you think I'm abandoning my humorless ways, allow me to explain exactly why this is funny using established theories from the philosophy of humor. Because yes, I even found a way to make slapstick comedy pretentious. One of the prevailing theories about why we find things funny is called incongruous juxtaposition theory. Super old philosopher guy Immanuel Kant said that laughter is an affection arising from the sudden transformation of a strained expectation into nothing. In other words, when you think you know what's coming, but something unexpected and absurd happens instead, that's funny. Humor is about setting up your expectations, then subverting them with some kind of unexpected silliness, cleverness, or just plain absurdity. This is not the only theory of humor, and even assuming its accuracy, it's still certainly not the only kind of humor. But it's a concept I think is worth keeping in mind, because a lot of established and beloved comedy does fit into this idea. From this classic joke in Airplane where a character engages in unexpected wordplay.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious, and don't call me Shirley.
To this iconic shot in Hot Fuzz. To this classic joke from the very earliest days of cinema. See, now you know what I'm talking about. What? No, Rickrolling is fun. Rickrolling is always fun. I will fight you on this. Point is, in short, there is humor in the unexpected, assuming, of course, that there are established expectations to subvert in the first place. And the animation system of Final Fantasy XIV comes with a whole lot of very well-established expectations. Since so many games use this method of set expressions and gestures to inject emotion into their characters, your average Final Fantasy XIV player immediately feels at home when they boot up this game. They'll then spend untold hours working their way through the first batch of story content. There are expectations in place for how characters look and move in this game in particular. Expectations so strong, they're practically invisible. It's just how the game works. Then, this. Hildibrand regularly moves in ways completely without precedent in the rest of the game. His face contorts in exaggerated expressions you'd never see other characters make. His gestures are often entirely unique, movements that you'll never see any other character perform. Hildibrand and a lot of the things that happen around him totally break the way characters and movement in this game usually work, and that's why the slapstick works so well. And it's kind of amazing that it does. I mean, half the comedy here is just Hildy making funny faces. That's gotta be pretty low on the comedy ladder, right? But the act of so thoroughly shattering the game's animation systems and the way that we expect these characters to move and emote is what makes it work. In other words, Hildibrand's comedy works as well as it does because it plays directly off of Final Fantasy XIV's visual limitations as a video game. Not just because he makes a funny face, but because after 50 hours watching people move normally in this game with limited, predictable character animation, having a character suddenly pull out this? Comes completely out of left field, and it's hard not to let out a chuckle when it happens. We in the analytical video game sphere like to talk a whole lot about how video games should be learning to tell stories in ways that are unique to them, and as silly as this gentleman's adventures are, I think it's a pretty good example of this. Not to say it's entirely without precedent, animation has been using art shifts for comedic effect for ages at this point. But while this could broadly be considered the same concept, the execution is very much based in how video games, specifically as a medium that needs to render all of its visual elements in real time, has to animate characters and conversations, and how the Final Fantasy XIV engine in particular does that. The need for animations to be constantly reused and repurposed in countless different contexts is very much unique to video games as a medium. Art reuse is common elsewhere, but not on this scale and out of such necessity. The expectation that characters will always move and emote in specific, reusable ways comes from this technical limitation. Anything can make funny faces and throw characters around for a laugh, but to create such absurdity in a game engine that thrives off reuse, and to play to the sheer, unexpected, out-of-place-ness of these visuals, that's not just slapstick. It's humor based on the very DNA of video games as a visual medium. And aside from being surprisingly hilarious, I think that's pretty cool. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. I've wanted to make a video about Hildibrand ever since I first found Nashu mourning in that cemetery in Thanalan, but I know you want more seriously analytical Final Fantasy XIV content, so that'll be coming up next. Watch this space. In the meantime, though, please do like, subscribe, comment, share, and check out my Patreon if you really like what I'm doing here, and I'll see you next time.